He held her hair back while she got sick in a bar bathroom. She confronted him about his drinking so many times that he lost count. For 9 years they built one of the most beloved marriages in television history, and then, without a single dramatic blow-up that anyone can point to, they simply stopped speaking. Today, John Goodman is finally answering the question millions of fans still ask: what actually killed the bond between him and Roseanne Barr, and why, after everything they built together, does he now say he doubts she even wants to hear from him? Before the tabloid headlines, before the tweet that ended a network deal in a single afternoon, there was just two comedians trying to make each other laugh on a Los Angeles soundstage. When Roseanne premiered in the fall of 1988, nobody in television expected it to become the phenomenon it did. Sitcoms of that era leaned toward glossy, upper-middle-class households with tidy problems and tidier resolutions. Roseanne did the opposite. It planted itself in a fictional Illinois town called Lanford and refused to look away from the reality most American families actually lived: overdue bills, dead-end jobs, kids who talked back, and parents who were too tired to pretend everything was fine. Audiences didn't just watch the Connor family. They recognized them. At the center of that recognition were two performances that clicked in a way few television pairings ever do. Roseanne Barr played the sharp-tongued, exhausted, fiercely loving matriarch. John Goodman played Dan Connor, a contractor with a big laugh and an even bigger heart, a man who could defuse a fight with one look and still somehow lose every argument to his wife. Goodman has said the two of them connected almost instantly on set, joking that they simply kept each other laughing from the very beginning. That chemistry wasn't manufactured by writers. It was real, and viewers could feel it through the screen. The ratings backed up what audiences already sensed. During its peak seasons, Roseanne regularly pulled in tens of millions of viewers a week, numbers that would be almost unthinkable for a broadcast comedy today. It became appointment television in the truest sense, a show families gathered around because they saw pieces of their own kitchen table arguments playing out on screen. Goodman later reflected that the sheer size of those audiences made the era feel genuinely unique, a moment in television history that will likely never be repeated in the same way. Awards recognition followed the ratings. Goodman won a Golden Globe for his portrayal of Dan Connor, a role that took him from a respected working actor to one of the most recognizable faces on American television almost overnight. On paper, it was everything an actor could ask for: critical respect, a devoted audience, and a character people genuinely loved. But the same visibility that earned him that trophy was also quietly becoming one of the hardest parts of his life to manage. Awards shows and magazine covers don't usually mention the toll that kind of sustained exposure takes on a person, and for a long time, Goodman didn't talk about it publicly either. But success came at a price that most of the audience never saw. As Roseanne grew into a cultural institution, Goodman found himself grappling with something he hadn't fully prepared for: the total loss of a normal life. Being recognized everywhere he went, unable to run an errand without becoming the center of attention, started to wear on him in ways fame rarely gets credit for. What began as flattering slowly curdled into something closer to dread. And like a lot of people who don't know how to sit with that kind of internal pressure, he reached for a drink instead of a solution. By his own account, Goodman's relationship with alcohol didn't start during Roseanne, but the show's success accelerated it in a serious way. He has openly described crossing a line he once swore he would never cross: drinking while he was actually on set, in the middle of a workday, on a hit television show watched by tens of millions of people. He's admitted that his speech would slur during filming and that he genuinely believed, at the time, he was hiding it well. Looking back, he's been blunt about how wrong that assumption was. The person who saw through it fastest wasn't a producer or a studio executive. It was Roseanne Barr. According to both of them, she confronted him directly about his drinking on more than one occasion during the show's original run. She had already lived through watching a husband battle substance abuse, and she recognized the warning signs in her co-star before most people around him did. Their relationship off-camera wasn't just professional courtesy, it was a real friendship, one where she stayed close enough to call him out when something was clearly wrong. By his own admission, the final years of the original series were rough, and he has said plainly that she was frightened for him during that stretch. Barr herself has confirmed just how close that off-camera friendship actually was. In interviews given years later, she recalled physically taking care of him during nights out when his drinking got the better of him, describing moments of literally holding him steady while he was sick. She's also been candid that she had her own struggles with alcohol during that same period, and that watching Goodman spiral was difficult precisely because she recognized pieces of herself in it. It paints a picture that's easy to miss from the outside. Two performers who spent their days making millions of people laugh on camera, then spent their nights quietly looking out for each other in ways the audience never saw. The unraveling reached a breaking point around a weekend that should have been a celebration. Goodman was set to accept his first major industry award and instead spent that weekend drinking heavily with friends, missing a rehearsal in the process. By the time the actual ceremony arrived, he was in a state he later described as physically shaking, still drinking, and yet somehow clear-headed enough for the first time to understand exactly how dangerous his situation had become. That moment of unwanted clarity is what finally pushed him toward treatment. Getting sober wasn't a quiet, private footnote in his career. It was, by his own description, one of the defining turns of his adult life. He entered a treatment program, did the difficult and unglamorous work that recovery actually requires, and built a sobriety that has now lasted for close to 2 decades. He's talked candidly about how it isn't a problem you solve once and move past. He still attends recovery meetings and treats it as something that has to be maintained daily rather than conquered permanently. He's also spoken about the physical side of turning his life around after quitting drinking, describing changes to how he ate and exercised as part of building a healthier daily routine, changes is credited with helping him feel better in his 60s than he did decades earlier. When the original Roseanne wrapped its run in 1997, Goodman didn't stay in Los Angeles chasing the next hit show. He and his wife, Annabeth, relocated to New Orleans, his hometown, trading the industry center of gravity for something quieter and more grounded. He said he was genuinely nervous about moving back to a city with such a strong drinking culture while still early in his sobriety, but he found a support community there that helped him stay on track. In the years that followed, he kept working steadily, building an unusually varied career that included prestige film roles and projects like The Big Lebowski, Argo, and The Artist, proof that his best years as an actor were still ahead of him even after stepping away from the show that first made him a household name. For roughly 2 decades, that felt like the closing chapter. Roseanne had already secured its place as a landmark of American television, but reviving a decades-old sitcom wasn't exactly a common move in the industry at that point. Then the broader television landscape shifted. Networks started chasing nostalgia hard, betting that audiences who grew up on certain shows would come back for a reunion with the people they remembered. When word got out that the original Connor family cast was reassembling, the reaction from longtime fans was immediate and enormous. Even Goodman, by his own admission, didn't see it as anything more than a short-lived experiment. He figured the revival would run for a handful of episodes and quietly fade out, more of a curiosity than a comeback. Instead, when the new season premiered in the spring of 2018, it drew astonishing numbers for broadcast television, instantly becoming one of the most watched programs of the season. Critics pointed to the same thing that had made the original series work: it hadn't lost touch with the working-class world it was built to represent. ABC moved quickly to renew the show for another season, and for a brief window, it looked like something rare had happened. A sitcom that ended in the 90s had come back and proven it could still dominate. That window closed almost as fast as it opened. Only weeks after the premiere, Roseanne Barr posted a tweet comparing a former advisor to President Barack Obama to a character from a well-known film franchise, using language widely condemned as racist. The backlash was immediate and overwhelming, spreading across social media and dominating entertainment news cycles within hours. ABC didn't wait long to respond. The network canceled the show outright, issuing a statement condemning her comments in the strongest possible terms. It was a stunning reversal for a series that had just posted the best ratings of the season and had already been renewed for more episodes. For the cast, the fallout created total uncertainty almost overnight. Goodman has since said he genuinely believed, once production shut down, that the story of Dan Connor was finished for good. He moved on to another project, taking a role on HBO's The Righteous Gemstones, fully expecting that chapter of his career to stay closed. The show that had defined so much of his life seemed to be over, this time for real, and there was no obvious path forward for a series built around a star the network had just publicly cut ties with. Goodman has since described that period as one of the harder emotional stretches of his career, even in sobriety. He said he was heartbroken by how abruptly everything fell apart, and that he told himself at the time it was simply the nature of show business and that he needed to let it go. But by his own admission, letting go wasn't as easy as he expected, and his acknowledged going through roughly a month of genuine depression in the aftermath, something he's connected to a broader tendency toward low moods that he's dealt with throughout his life. It's a reminder that even for a performer with 2 decades of sobriety behind him, watching a project he cared about collapse in a matter of days because of someone else's actions wasn't something he could simply shrug off. Behind the scenes, though, the math didn't add up to a simple ending. Millions of viewers were still emotionally invested in the Connor family. The surviving cast members wanted to keep working together. And despite the controversy attached to Barr herself, there was clearly still an audience hungry for that world. Executives faced an unusual question: could a show built around one specific star's chemistry survive without her? The answer came in the form of The Conners, a continuation series that kept the rest of the original cast intact while writing Roseanne Connor out of the story through an off-screen death from an opioid overdose, a blunt, deliberate way of signaling a clean break from the past. Goodman stepped back into the role of Dan Connor without knowing how long the new version of the show would actually last. He admitted he had no real expectations going in, given how quickly he'd already accepted that the franchise was finished once before. What followed surprised nearly everyone in the industry. Rather than collapsing without its original headline star, The Conners found its footing and ran for 7 seasons, becoming a genuine second act rather than a footnote. Dan Connor evolved across those years from half of a comedic marriage into the emotional center of an entire multi-generational household, still grappling with the same themes of financial strain, grief, and everyday family friction that had defined the original series decades earlier. While the show itself endured, the friendship that had once anchored it did not. Goodman has been remarkably direct about this in recent interviews, confirming that he and Barr went roughly 7 to 8 years without speaking to one another at all. When asked outright whether he still had any contact with her, his response was simple and a little sad: he doubted she even wanted to hear from him. It's a strikingly quiet way to describe the end of a professional and personal bond that once defined an entire genre of television. What makes Goodman's account particularly interesting is how little bitterness runs through it. Even in the immediate aftermath of the 2018 scandal, when plenty of people in Hollywood were distancing themselves from Barr as fast as possible, Goodman didn't join that chorus. He said publicly that he felt awful about how everything unfolded, that he still cared about her, and that he wished her well. He went further than most of his castmates were willing to go at the time, stating plainly that he knew, based on the person he'd worked alongside for years, that the label being attached to her didn't match the woman he knew. Years later, when asked whether he regretted defending her that way, he said he had no regrets about it at all. Barr's side of the story carries a very different emotional temperature. In interviews since her firing, she has confirmed she doesn't stay in touch with any of her former castmates, describing them as belonging to a closed chapter of her life. She's acknowledged having genuinely fond memories of the years they spent working together, but she's also expressed real anger about how it all ended, particularly over having her character killed off while the show continued on without her. At one point she stated bluntly that none of her former castmates were still her friends, framing the entire experience as something firmly in her past rather than an open wound she was interested in revisiting. She's also revealed that producers reportedly floated the idea of bringing her back in some limited form during The Conners, possibly as a dream sequence or a hallucination glimpsed by one of the other characters. By her own account, she turned the offer down, frustrated by the idea of returning to a production she felt had pushed her out only to later want her back once it suited the ratings. Whether or not that offer was ever seriously pursued behind the scenes, the fact that she's spoken about it publicly says a lot about how far apart her version of the ending is from Goodman's. Where he talks about missing her, she talks about a chapter she has no interest in reopening. It's tempting to boil the entire story down to one tweet, one press release, one cancellation. But listening to how Goodman actually talks about it, the real ending wasn't a single event. It was a slow chain reaction. The controversy triggered the cancellation forced a painful choice about how to move forward without its star, and that choice reshaped every relationship that had been built around the original show. Once that trust broke, there wasn't an obvious way back to what the cast had before, no matter how much affection remained underneath the silence. One of the more telling moments from Goodman's recent interviews came when he was asked, point blank, what he would actually say to Barr if the two of them crossed paths today. After years of headlines about their estrangement, his answer wasn't dramatic at all. He said he'd simply greet her the way you'd greet anyone you used to know well, a casual hello, asking how she's doing. No settling of scores, no rehashing old grievances, just the kind of low-key warmth you'd expect from someone who still, on some level, thinks of her as an old friend rather than a cautionary tale. That mix of affection and distance has stayed consistent every time he's brought her up publicly. He talks about the early days of the show with real fondness, the way they clicked immediately and kept each other entertained on set. He remembers the scale of what they built together and the sheer number of people who tuned in every week to watch it. At the same time, he seems fully aware that none of that can simply be rebuilt on demand. The original show doesn't exist anymore. The reboot ended in scandal. The franchise that followed became something separate from what audiences originally fell in love with, carried forward by a cast that had to figure out how to be the Connor family without the woman who created them in the first place. When The Conners eventually wrapped its own run this year, Goodman described the ending as an emotional one for him personally. He talked about being resistant to change and admitted the 7 seasons of the spin-off went by faster than he expected, becoming its own extended chapter in a career that had already spanned decades. The finale reportedly closed with a quiet, almost meta moment. Dan Connor alone, speaking directly to the audience, essentially saying goodnight and thank you, a bookend to a series that first opened in 1988 with Dan and Roseanne laughing together on that same couch. Goodman has offered his own theory for why both versions of the show connected so deeply with viewers for so many years. He believes audiences saw themselves in the Connors because the family was never dressed up to be aspirational. They were ordinary people wrestling with bills, health scares, family arguments, and uncertainty about what came next, and that ordinariness was exactly what made millions of households feel like they were watching their own lives reflected back at them. That, according to Goodman, is the real reason the end of the original show still matters to people decades later. It was never just a sitcom to begin with. For a lot of families, it felt like checking in on people they actually knew. And according to Goodman, what truly ended things wasn't really the network's decision or even the controversy itself. It was the quiet, permanent loss of the specific chemistry between two people who happened to make each other laugh on a soundstage back in 1988, a connection that, once broken, simply couldn't be recreated in any other form. The show could continue. The character could be replaced with a storyline about grief and moving forward. But the very thing that made the original Roseanne feel lightning in a bottle special, that particular partnership, was gone the moment the two of them stopped speaking, and neither Goodman's public affection for her nor the years that have passed since have been enough to bring it back. Today, Goodman still talks about Roseanne Barr with more warmth than bitterness, even while acknowledging plainly that the friendship they once had probably isn't coming back. He remembers the laughter. He remembers what it felt like to be part of something that big. And he seems to have made peace with the fact that some parts of a person's history simply close, whether you want them to or not. Barr, for her part, appears to have made a similar kind of peace, just from the opposite direction, choosing distance over reconciliation and describing the entire chapter as something she's already moved past. So what actually ended Roseanne for good? Not one tweet. Not one press release. According to the man who spent 9 years standing next to her on that soundstage, it was something much quieter. Two people who used to make each other laugh, who simply stopped talking, and never really found their way back. What do you think? Do you believe John Goodman and Roseanne Barr could ever reconcile after everything that's happened, or has too much time and too much history passed for that to be realistic? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.